Welcome to this edition of Diligence Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, and I'll be your host for today's show. Today, we're going to talk about how boards can work better in a chaotic world. And joining me is someone special. Let me introduce Dr. Dambisa Moyo, who serves on the global corporate boards of 3M Corporation, Chevron, and Conde Nast. She is the author of 4 New York Times bestselling books. Her new book is How Boards Work and How They Can Work Better in a Chaotic World. And if any of you are wondering how to go about getting on 3 such influential boards, Dambisa holds a PhD in economics from Oxford University and a master's degree from Harvard University, and also is the co-principal of Versica Investments. Hopefully, Dambisa, I pronounced that correctly.
Perfectly.
Well, welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here.
Let's start by talking about your most recent bestseller, How Boards Work and How They Can Work Better in a Chaotic World. I must admit that usually when I see books on board topics, I take them with a grain of salt because typically the author of the book has never served on a public company board, okay? So you come to this show with some great board cred and some street cred, okay? Which obviously you have a great deal of experience serving on a public board. And as somebody that has done the same, I'm really looking forward to hearing about sort of how your experiences were and what led to you sort of sitting down and saying, this is the message I have to send in this book.
Well, thank you so much for hosting me. I'm delighted to be able to participate in another Diligent gathering. And really, in terms of why I've written this book, it's the answer is really twofold. One is I found it really important to reassert the important role that corporations play in the global economy, but also in society writ large. If you look back to the last 21 years, since 2000, really the mood music has shifted to be quite negative, anti-growth, anti-corporations, anti-capitalism. And yet corporations that have been in existence for hundreds of years and centuries even, have been big time proponents of an innovation, as we just seen with Pfizer, Moderna, et cetera, working with governments to deliver a vaccine in a short period of time. They provide jobs, but also they are the base for tax revenue. That's really important for government to deliver public goods like education and healthcare and infrastructure. So that was one of the reasons I felt like it was really important at this time to really explain why corporations matter and how boards fit into that equation. The second reason I was motivated to write the book is really understanding that there was a bit of ignorance or blind spot, not only to what the mandate of what boards is, but also what levers boards actually have to effect change. And this is particularly important because really the board responsibility has evolved from just being overseeing strategy and picking the CEO to be responsible for a lot of ESG, environmental, social, and governance issues. And yet, I think a lot of people have high expectations of that role, but haven't really given much thought to what levers boards actually have to effect change.
Well, I certainly enjoyed the book. And in the book, you talk about effective boards being transparent, knowledgeable, and diverse. But I think what I'm most interested in asking you now is how board members should be more involved in sort of setting strategy without sort of crossing that imaginary line, and getting into the C-suite realm. How do they work together?
So it's an important balance to be struck. As a practical matter, boards meet about once a year, specifically to discuss a strategy day. However, I think that the issue of developing or thinking about the strategy in the first place is something where a lot of board members around the table can provide insights and perspectives from their own day-to-day work, whether it's in public policy or academia and other corporations, into that process. And you're right, we don't want a situation where boards are moving from a role of oversight into management of the process, or indeed of the product in terms of what comes out. But I do think that there is more scope for board input into that process. And it might be as simple as a huddle day with boards, only the independent board members having a conversation about the key trends and things that they're hearing and seeing, and making sure that a lot of those issues, whether it's inflation or mental illness or the rise of China or issues around inequality, are fed through in the thinking around the strategy pack that shows up for us. So I think it's probably on the margin as opposed to a sort of complete overhaul of the existing strategy. And there are many other suggestions that I put in the book. But I think on balance, it really is about getting more out of the board in terms of some of these strategic questions.
In your travels, do you see more CEOs being receptive to board input in the way of strategy versus, if you look back 20 years ago, there was a lot of what I'll call imperial CEOs. But have you seen sort of a more understanding of how to use the board more effectively?
I have, actually. I've been serving on boards about 12 years now. And when I first joined, very fortuitously, there was a sort of surprise for me because generally boards in the run up to that time were very interested only in what I call conventional board members, people who'd come from the C-suite, so previous CEOs and CFOs. And since I joined my first board, there's been a real widening of the aperture as we look for candidates. And that's really driven by the CEO's recognition that the world is far more complex. There are geopolitical threats, rise of China, issues that are more in the social realm around inequality, climate change, concerns around digitization and technology, et cetera, that perhaps really narrowing the source of board candidates to only ex-CEOs and CFOs might be doing a disservice to the board. And of course, traditionally, we haven't had a great pipeline of women and minorities. And so to the extent that we ought to have more diversity in these rooms where the decisions are happening, it's been another great improvement, and I think additive to CEOs to think about, having that different talent, different perspective brought into the room, whether it's academicians or policymakers, et cetera. It's probably worth me just saying that I think as a rule of thumb, you probably still want about 40% or at least 40% of the board to be from the C-suite, because that's an important perspective that's really important for the day-to-day running of the organization that the CEO needs.
Yeah, I think I'm correct that I just saw a Spencer Stewart number, and this will make you feel good, that I think about 72% of the new directors that have been brought on Fortune 500 companies this year are either women or minority candidates. So somebody hopefully is getting the message. But when I look at certain groups like Hispanics and others, there's still it still seems like a slow movement to get that representation on boards.
But I think that the important issue is that I imagine that for a lot of those candidates, if not all of them, there's no loss in quality. So it's actually upside for the organization. And I often say, no one should do us any favors. I don't want to be in a boardroom where I'm simply there because of my race or gender. I want to be there because I have a PhD from Oxford, or I spent almost 10 years at Goldman Sachs, and I can add real value on questions of risk or strategy, investment questions or compensation. And I hope that number just doesn't reflect optics that might look good on a sort of an ESG ranking or on the cover of an annual report. But I think it's important for us to emphasize that that's talent, real talent that has been overlooked over a long periods of time. And we now have an opportunity to remedy that and really benefit. It's not just about survival. It's about thriving into the 21st century. You've got to have those different perspectives. So I think that's wonderful and worth pursuing more aggressively.
Yeah, I work with a new director group as well, and your attitude is right. And if they aren't giving you space, you have to make space to make sure that you're a contributor to the board. So it's on both sides of the fence. But honestly, I like what I'm seeing, and I just hope that the trend can continue. So any final words of wisdom for our board members or corporate secretaries that are the viewing audience that might be helpful to sort of address the challenges that you think you see lying ahead for global boards?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we're all pretty attuned to the fact that there are going to be ongoing issues with the rise of China and what that might mean for globalization and supply chains. We're all pretty au fait with issues around digitization and what that might mean, both in terms of risk mitigation on the downside, things like cyber, but also opportunities on the upside to deliver high quality products faster to our customers. But, as we navigate these issues, as well as other things like climate change, thinking about what actions we really ought to be taking as boards, and also thinking about inequality and the role that corporations should play in society. We don't want to lose anybody who's highly talented. And, I think that this is an important piece, tagging on to the last question, which is to say we don't want to fight discrimination with discrimination. We don't want to lose high talented majority men in our efforts. And it's important that message is absolutely clear, that in order for us as organizations to compete and win, we need talent. And the talent comes from everywhere and anywhere. And that's something we should not lose sight of, given the scale, but also the speed of the challenges that we're facing ahead.
Yeah, great words of wisdom. And where can people get a copy of your latest book, or actually any of your 4 books?
Well, at the risk of sounding like a television commentator, I would say anywhere that great books are sold. So you can get it on Amazon. You can go via my website, bookstores. I'm very, very happy and I'm really grateful that it's done so well. It's on the Wall Street Journal, one of the best business books. I think it's number 5 this year. So very happy with its performance. And I think that means you can probably get it in most places.
Well, Dambisa, I just can't thank you enough for taking time in your busy schedule to join us. And I appreciate you coming on the show.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
And that will conclude this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take another look at a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.